Do you ever get that feeling of deja vu? Like you're witnessing the same thing over and over again? Well, if you're an African football fan, you might have felt that way very recently.
After almost 3 decades of shaping African football, Issa Hayatu's been ousted as chief of the continent's Football Federation. Madagascar's Ahmed wins the CAF election for its new president. Also, out with the old, in with the new, and African football fans are hoping that applies to more than just faces. Hayatu's leadership was, at times, dogged with scandal, and Ahmed has promised change for CAF.
About 4 years ago, Ahmed promised change following his election as CAF president. 4 years later, and African football is still mired in corruption and dysfunction. On March 12th, South African billionaire Patrice Motsepe was elected unopposed as CAF's new president. Like Ahmed before him, Motsepe has promised change and a brighter future. Today we ask, what does the election of Patrice Motsepe mean for the future of African football?
His presidency and election by acclamation raises more questions than answers.
Samindra Kunti is a football journalist at Inside World Football.
Why would a billionaire businessman want to wallow in the murky world of CAF politics? And secondly, does Motsepe even have the experience and know-how to navigate the complex world of African football?
Before we get into who Patrice Motsepe is and what his impact on CAF might be, let's look back at CAF's recent history. What happened to their last president, Ahmad?
Good question and an important question. Ahmad succeeded Issa Hayatu in 2017 with behind-the-scenes support from FIFA boss Gianni Infantino. Now, last year, the global governing body banned Ahmed from all football-related activity for 5 years over ethics violations, a sanction that was later reduced to 2 years by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Now remember, CAF ripped up a 1 billion television and marketing rights deal with France-based company Lagardère Sports. And a recent audit by PricewaterhouseCoopers suggested that tens of millions of dollars had been misappropriated as well at the African governing body. So plenty of reasons why Ahmed is no longer an official at CAF.
So what kind of situation is Motsepe walking into right now?
Well, we've just been highlighting how Ahmed's reign came to an end. Motsepe is walking into a fairly catastrophic situation. CAF is a cash-strapped organization and remains bedeviled by endemic corruption and old-fashioned thinking. It needs a lot of reform from top to bottom, and that includes reform at the level of the member associations as well, namely the national football associations.
Now, like any election, there has been plenty of politics at play. Can you describe the run-up to this recent election?
That would be very exhausting to go into every little detail, but I'll try and at least paint a good picture. The last few weeks in the run-up to the elections, which ultimately turned into an election by acclamation, were quite fascinating. I think there was a lot of horse trading and maneuvering going on, almost at an unprecedented scale, I would say. And that resulted in the so-called Pact of Rabat, paving the way for Motsepe to become the CAF president. His rival candidates for the presidency, Augustin Senghor from Senegal, Ahmed Yahya from Mauritania, and Jacques Anouma from Ivory Coast, withdrew from the race, while his other rival, Ahmed, was barred from running. And all of this is without mentioning the role of FIFA president Gianni Infantino behind the scenes.
So you mentioned this pact. What was this pact that you're speaking of?
So essentially, this was a meeting between all the candidates running for the CAF presidency, taking place in Rabat, Morocco, weeks before the actual election, and a deal of sorts was brokered there, leading to Motsepe's coronation, and the other rivals were offered various positions within the organization. So some of Motsepe's rivals today are, in fact, his vice presidents as well.
What do you make of FIFA President Gianni Infantino's involvement in this election?
That was perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the entire election. In the weeks leading up to the Rabat Congress, Infantino flew around Africa in a private jet supplied by Qatar, and the FIFA boss visited a dozen African countries. And obviously his timing was quite conspicuous and invited quite a lot of scrutiny. Why would he travel the continent at such a delicate moment? But I think, and that's key, Africa is pivotal to Infantino's future plans. He wants to upgrade the African game, thinking of his own vision for the future Club World Cup. And in a way, he's also doing what every FIFA president has ever done, and that's thinking about votes. The African voting bloc represents 54 votes for the 2023 FIFA presidential elections. Now, I want to point out or stress here that it's obviously a wrong perception to consider Africa as one monolithic voting bloc. CAF and all its regional bodies are far more complex. But Infantino is clever, and he's using a sort of stick and carrot approach to control CAF, which is ultimately the second biggest confederation in the world. The funds that FIFA can distribute represent the carrot. The ethics committee and the normalization committees that FIFA can impose represent the stick. So when you think about all of this, when you look at this bigger picture, it looks like Infantino has got things pretty much sewed up.
So just to be clear, the implication is that, CAF's new leaders are kind of beholden to him.
Absolutely. That is very much the implication. And there is a lot of circumstantial evidence. The FIFA boss crisscrossing the continent on the eve of the elections in the middle of a global pandemic as well. Why would you travel during the worst global sanitary crisis in living memory? Doesn't make sense. Also, when Senegal's Augustin Senior, one of Motsepe's rivals, stood down, he actually referenced FIFA's proposal in his statement. Now, that was perhaps a slip of the tongue, but a very telling one. FIFA as well sent Matthias Grafström and Veron Mosengo Omba to Rabat to facilitate the Pact of Rabat and perhaps to broker a deal. Now, Grafström and Veron are two very close advisors of the FIFA president. You sort of could consider them his stormtroopers, if you like. But I think the most damning piece of evidence came straight after Motsepe's coronation in Morocco. Within 48 hours, Veron was appointed as the new Secretary General of CAF in a move that resembled Fatma Samoura's appointment as General Delegate for Africa in 2019. So essentially, FIFA is parachuting its own personnel into the CAF organization.
I want to focus on Patrice Motsepe, and who he is. I think 99% of our listeners will be unaware of who he is. You profiled him recently in Off the Pitch. Where is he from, and what was his childhood like?
Well, obviously, your listeners could find quite a bit of information about Mr. Motsepe on Forbes, as he is Africa's 9th richest billionaire. If we look at his roots, he was born in Soweto, the big township outside of Johannesburg, and which was also the backdrop to the 2010 World Cup final. It's there that Patrice was born. He was a son to Augustine Motsepe, a chief of the Tswana tribe from the northern provinces of South Africa. And Augustine named his son after Patrice Lumumba. I think it's fair to say that Motsepe, as a child, enjoyed some privilege. He went to a Catholic school and escaped so-called Bantu education, which was designed for the black masses of South Africa and aimed at generating a sort of menial labor workforce. And as a kid, after hours, Motsepe worked in his father's stores, a general store, a retail store, a restaurant, a beer hall. And I think that's where he got his first exposure to business.
So what did he do after he grew up and went to university?
Yeah, so as you say, he went to university. He went to the University of Wits in Johannesburg, which is one of the better universities in South Africa. You have to remember that those were obviously still the days of apartheid. So it was rare, but not exceptional for a black person to attend university. In this respect, the late Nelson Mandela is the most obvious example. Motsepe graduated from law school and joined Bowman Gilson, a law firm in Johannesburg, where he rose through the ranks to become the first black partner.
And yet, despite a great job at a good law firm, he went into the mining industry. How did that happen?
Absolutely right. He was quite a star at his law firm, a bright, young, highly educated black lawyer at a top firm. His life was pretty comfortable, but I think, or at least that's what one can only assume, I think that he wanted more. He pivoted away from the legal profession and, as you say, he set his sight on mining. The sense that I get is that his move was frowned upon a little bit. Remember, mining was old school and very rough. It was dominated by a clique of white men. And here was all of a sudden this young black man who basically had it all anyway, trying to break into this conservative industry. So I think he was perhaps seen as a bit of a maverick.
And so how did he build this mining empire that would eventually make him a billionaire?
I think he opted for a pretty risky strategy. Motsepe first was a subcontractor before acquiring distressed mines. Now, distressed mines are basically mines towards the end of their lives. And it's quite difficult to squeeze a profit out of them. And you have to remember as well, at the time, black South Africans had no access to credit. So that was another major obstacle. Motsepe struck a deal with Anglo-American, the biggest miners in the world at the time. They loaned him some money to future profit share. He acquired those marginal or distressed mines, mainly in Klerksdorp, not too far from Johannesburg, and later in the Free State as well, reassessed those assets and then remodeled those mines. But there was skepticism out there, I think. Anglo-American had failed to make a profit from most of those mines. So why would Motsepe all of a sudden succeed where they had failed? But I think our young lawyer friend proved to be very savvy. He deployed an experienced team, negotiated lower salaries for some of the workers in exchange for a profit share, a strategy that had been unheard of. And also the economy was in his favor at the time. As a result, his business boomed and was flourishing.
In your piece, there's a quote from a prominent miners' union member who said that Motsepe, quote, was about collaboration and compromise, end quote. Why did he say that about Motsepe?
Yeah, a number of people told me that Motsepe was about compromise. Bobby Gottsell was a manager at Anglo-American at the time, and he backed Motsepe early on because he could see that South Africa was changing after apartheid. And he told me that one of Motsepe's main qualities was that he could listen to the other side. Motsepe would sit on the negotiating table with an open mind. And now usually big businessmen or tycoons or billionaires, if you like, don't really tend to listen. But early on, Motsepe had that quality. And I think that was instrumental in building not only his mining empire, but also his reputation.
So in 2004, Motsepe jumps into football and buys Mamelodi Sundowns, which is a prominent team in the South African League. You know, he was the president up until, just when he was elected CAF president. How did his 17 years running that club go?
I would say it was a tale of two halves, if you allow me to say that. He went through a raft of advisors. Some of them were very dubious advisors with bad reputations in the domestic game. He also indulged his infatuation with the late Johan Cruyff, appointing Johan Neeskens and Stoichkov as head coaches following his recommendation. There was also the Frenchman Henri Michel, perhaps another vanity appointment. So I think in the first half, or at least at the start of his ownership, he didn't surround himself with the right people. But the arrival of coach Pitso Mosimane in 2012, that was a sort of new beginning. Mosimane has a very strong personality, and he quickly got rid of some of the rotten apples and changed the modus operandi of the club, centralizing decision-making. Obviously, Motsepe still had the final say, but Pitso was involved in every single important decision, and that changed the fortunes of the club. They have been the dominant force in South African football, even now that Pitso has left for Al Ahly in Egypt. They've won the domestic crown consecutively, I think 3 times in a row, 4 times in a row. And in 2016, they won the African Champions League as well. So Mamelodi Sundowns absolutely dominate South African football, but it wasn't easy at the start for Motsepe.
What do you think his time running the club tells you about how he regards football and how he operates football organizations?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely fascinating question, because a lot of people look at Motsepe and see this great businessman with his business acumen. If you look closer at the way he has run Mamelodi Sundowns over the years, there are a number of questions, because is there a business model to the way he runs the club? He simply splashed the cash to get those players and to get those reinforcements that Mosimane wanted. His deep pockets have transformed, I think, the marketplace in South Africa. If you look at Kaizer Chiefs and Orlando Pirates, traditionally 2 of the heavyweights in the South African game, they can no longer compete with Mamelodi Sundowns. They no longer have first pick for players. Motsepe has simply priced them out of the market. So you have an owner who just spends and spends and spends, and who for a long time surrounded himself with the wrong advisors, put those things together, and that doesn't really inspire great confidence.
So having said all that, why do you think he chose to run for CAF president?
That's the million-dollar question, Josh. Why on earth would a man of his reputation, with his business acumen and mining empire, want to enter or wallow in the murky world of African football politics? It's easy to see why African football would want Motsepe. He's seen as a person who can guide them to a brighter and much more lucrative future, it's a lot harder to try and understand Motsepe's interest. And to this day, his interest in CAF and in African football politics somewhat remains shrouded in mystery.
He's Africa's first black billionaire, and now he's CAF's first Anglophone or English-speaking president. What do you make of that last bit about him being CAF's first English-speaking president, naturally, or Anglophone?
Yeah, it's quite a change for African football. Historically, the Francophone bloc has been very powerful on the continent. But when Motsepe launched his manifesto, he was flanked by the FA president of Nigeria, Amaju Pinnick, and he was flanked by the president of COSAFA, a regional football governing body. And those allies at the time, that was quite a number of weeks before the election, were already very, very confident that he was going to win. They were talking about more than 35 votes. So I think it was quite a coup for him to convince the electorate that he is the right man to lead Africa forward, given that there has always been so much skepticism towards the potential of an Anglophone president at CAF. At the same time, there's always been the perceived or supposed behind-the-scenes support from Gianni Infantino, which probably made his ascension to the throne much easier.
What policy or reforms has he indicated he plans on pursuing since he took over the role?
Well, going back to his manifesto launch, he emphasized good governance, global best practices, investment in African football infrastructure, increasing prize money, and statutory reforms. Those plans would and will be high on his agenda as CAF president. He has repeatedly stressed as well the need to engage more with the private sector, building partnerships and sponsorships with the private sector and other potential partners sort of formed a continuous theme throughout his election campaign. And obviously he has easy access to all of Africa's leading businessmen and companies, and he has repeatedly referenced MTN, one of the major telecom players, and Total, the oil company. He wants to reinforce ties with those companies to bring that more lucrative future to African football.
Now, a lot of the things that you just mentioned are things we've heard in the past by previous presidents. Good governance, generating more money. Do you think he's equipped to turn CAF around, or are the problems deeper and more systemic than he's able to solve?
Well, at his manifesto launch, he indicated that he wants to be a one-term president, which is, well, unheard of as well. Motsepe seems to think that he can turn around African football in a matter of years. That is a no-nonsense approach, but perhaps also naive. Motsepe looks like a lame duck president to me because of his association with Gianni Infantino. And at the same time, he's flanked by all his rivals in their capacities as vice presidents. So to which extent will he facilitate FIFA's agenda? To which extent will he bow to the agenda of those that surround him? And then there is a danger, I think, as well, that some in Africa will see Motsepe's access to capital and business as the opportunity for a new gravy train, one running parallel with the FIFA development money, all of which means that Motsepe is probably not the right person to tackle CAF's problems, which are, as you pointed out, systemic.
Samindra Kunti is a football journalist at Inside World Football. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about the songs in the episode show notes. This episode was produced by myself and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler. Thanks for listening to Football Today.